Thank you so much. Senator Wells, followed by Senator Massicotte.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, panel, for coming and the good work that you do. My question is about, in your paragraph 22, Canada is the only G7 country that's not achieved any emissions reduction since 1990. What's the measure? And I want to talk a little bit more about the measure after I hear your answer. But is it per capita? Is it total emissions? What's the measure?
So the measure is illustrated in the following exhibit of our report, and it is the percentage change in total greenhouse gas emissions in each country. So that's the measure we use, although Canada is also a laggard in terms of per capita emissions. So we don't address that in this report, but we have in other reports. But in this exhibit, total emissions, the percentage change from the baseline of 1990 is illustrated in blue. So Canada's are up since 1990. All the other G7 countries are down. And then in dark gray, using the baseline, the more recent baseline of 2005, all the G7 countries are down at least some, but Canada is down the least. So in either case, Canada's in last place, whether we look at it from 1990 or 2005, in terms of percentage change in greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so percentage change, that was
Yes.
the answer that I was looking for. But what about, excuse me, in total emissions? Not percentage change, but total emissions. Where does Canada rank in G7?
In G7, I would have to get that for you. Total emissions generally over the last 10 to 20 years, we're in the 10 to 12th slot worldwide, which is somewhat surprising considering our population is usually in the 35 to 40th, so somewhere near Ukraine or Morocco, or in terms of population. So we do have a lot of emissions compared to our population size.
Yeah, and a different discussion, but I don't put a lot of value in per capita, because when we look at China or India, which have massive populations and massive emissions, we compare poorly, which doesn't make sense to me as a measure. But again, for another time.
It's clear that every country needs to do its part, and certain countries have a bigger impact than others based on their total emissions and their population. But Canada is surprisingly, even though it's 37th, 38th in terms of population, our emissions are not insignificant. They're, as I said, probably in the 10 to 12 range out worldwide.
But that would still be 1.5% of global emissions.
Yeah, the figure is usually cited as 1.5, 1.6. Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to get a comment on. We talk about. You talk about in your opening remarks about changing from a gasoline fleet to an electric fleet, and sort of what I'll call important things, but they're maybe more symbolic things. How global a view do you look at what Canada might be doing or is doing when we look at the largest or the larger global emissions causes, like obviously China, India, and the U.S. as nations, but also volcanoes, wildfires, war, the emissions from the airline industry, which have such a huge impact in global emissions, and we're doing these small things which are important, but maybe more important symbolically. What's your view on that? Because we really, I think, in my view, we have to take a global view in this. We have to do our part, but we also have to look at what effect it's having globally.
Yeah, so doing our part is essential. It's a whole of society, but it's a whole of planet problem. Given that there are about 200 countries and then subnational governments under that, almost any jurisdiction could say, well, if we do our part and the others don't, then nothing significant will happen. And that's the nature of the beast when you have a planet carved up into so many different countries and jurisdictions. Canada's not the biggest emitter, but it's not an insignificant emitter either, and it's going to require collective action in each doing their part. If we don't get a handle on the large emitters in terms of countries or large emission sources in terms of fossil fuels, in particular coal in other countries, not as big an issue in Canada as it used to be, then this would all be for naught. But the idea of these, conferences of the parties that just concluded a couple of days ago at the United Nations is to try to bring together everybody to avoid a tragedy of the commons, because each individual state or subnational government can view itself as insignificant and not the major part of the problem, because by definition, with that large of a number of jurisdictions, no single country can solve it. And that shouldn't lead us to inaction, though. It should lead us to collective action.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to go around too as well.
Yeah, okay. Because you are talking about that, can I ask you to just explain what is the NDCs and that how Canada performs based on current policies and the national determined contributions?
Yeah, so under the Paris Agreement, which is the latest key climate change document at the international level, starting with Rio in 1992 and going through Kyoto and Copenhagen and so on, the Paris Agreement took an approach that was different than the other agreements. First of all, it set a very tangible target in terms of an actual global temperature limit, in terms of preferably 1.5. And at most 2 degrees. So instead of just looking at emissions, they looked at the actual result, which was to limit global warming to preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're at about 1.1 or 1.2 already, so we're already in danger. So each country under the Paris Agreement was to set for itself an emissions target, and this is called the NDC, the nationally determined contribution. Canada set an initial one after Paris and then ratcheted it up to 40 to 45% GHG reduction based on the 2005 baseline. So that's what we're measuring against. Our audit office looks at the commitment Canada's made in terms of its nationally determined contributions set out internationally and in domestic commitments, and how close they are to achieving that particular target of 40 to 45%. That's the current target, but as I mentioned, it's ratcheted up from the previous one. It's quite conceivable, given the global stocktake that happened this week at the UN level, that Canada will be under pressure to actually increase its NDC, and that's all the more reason for Canada to look for other measures to reduce its emissions, because 40 to 45% is the current target. It may move to something in the 50 to 60% range in the next time there's an NDC created for Canada.